After his grandfather's will was read, a young man who'd spent his life in the system was handed a key, a small bundle of cash, and a hand-drawn map to a sealed cave in the mountains. What he found there wasn't treasure, but a truth that would force him to choose between a safe life and a dangerous justice. If you've ever felt like your past was a closed book, or that you were alone against the world, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and new carpet, a sterile combination that seemed designed to absorb grief. I sat in a leather chair that was too big for me, its cool surface a stark contrast to the frayed cuffs of my state-issued jacket. I was 18 years and 3 days old. For the last 10 of those years, I'd been a ward of the state, a file in a cabinet, a name on a list. Before that, I was just Leo, a kid who lived with his grandfather in a small house that always smelled of sawdust and pine needles. Then the accident happened. Then Grandpa got sick. Then the system swallowed me whole. Now I was officially an adult, free, and apparently an heir. The word felt foreign, like a coat that didn't fit. The lawyer, a man named Arthur Davies with tired eyes and a neatly trimmed gray beard, slid a thin folder across the polished expanse of his desk. "As you know," he began, his voice a low, practiced hum, "your grandfather, Elias Vance, passed away 3 weeks ago." I nodded, my throat tight. I hadn't been allowed to go to the funeral. A social worker named Brenda, who always smelled faintly of peppermint, had told me it was better this way, that it would be too disruptive to my transition plan. Transition plan. That was what they called it when they handed you a plastic bag with your few belongings and pointed you toward the door. "His will is quite straightforward," Mr. Davies continued, oblivious to the storm in my chest. "He had very few assets of monetary value. There's the property, of course. 2 acres and a cabin in Briar Creek. It's been unoccupied for some time." He cleared his throat, a delicate sound. "There are also significant back taxes owed, and a lien from a local development firm, Blackwood Holdings. They made him an offer years ago, which he refused. The offer, adjusted for today, still stands. Frankly, son, selling is your only viable option. It would clear the debts and leave you with a modest sum, enough for a deposit on an apartment, a start." A start. The word echoed in the quiet room. My whole life had been a series of false starts. Every foster home, every group facility was supposed to be a start. They never were. They were just holding patterns. I stared at the folder, at the official-looking seal. It felt like another form, another piece of institutional paperwork defining my non-existence. "So I just sign it away?" I asked. My voice was rough, unused. "The house?" "The property," he corrected gently. "It's not much of a house anymore, I'm afraid, but yes, that would be my professional recommendation. It's the clean slate option." A clean slate. I'd been promised that before, too. It usually meant they just lost your old file. Mr. Davies sighed, sensing my hesitation. He seemed like a decent man, just tired of delivering bad news to people who'd already had their share. He pushed the folder a little closer. "The will names you as the sole beneficiary of the estate, such as it is." He then reached into a drawer and pulled out 3 items. The first was a thick manila envelope. He opened it and counted out a small stack of bills. "He left this for you specifically, for your 18th birthday. It's $2,000. He stipulated it was for your immediate needs." My eyes widened. It was more money than I'd ever seen in one place. It felt heavy, dangerous. The second item was a single, old-fashioned iron key. It was ornate and heavy, with a complex toothed bit. It looked like something that would open a castle door, not a derelict cabin. "This is for the front door," Mr. Davies said, though he looked doubtful. "Presumably." He pushed it across the desk next to the cash. Then he paused. He looked from me to the last item in his hand, a roll of yellowed paper tied with a piece of twine. He seemed genuinely uncertain. "And then there's this." His instructions were very specific. This was to be given to you, and only you, after the will was read. I have no idea what it is. It was not part of the legal estate. He slid the roll across the desk. It stopped next to the key and the money. My inheritance. A mountain of debt, a pittance in cash, a skeleton key, and a mystery scroll. For a second, a bubble of dry, humorless laughter rose in my throat. It was the most absurd, most perfectly dysfunctional welcome to adulthood I could have imagined. 10 years of silence, and this was his final word. I reached out, my fingers tracing the brittle edge of the paper. It felt ancient. I looked up at Mr. Davies. "That's it?" "That's it," he confirmed, his expression a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "I'll need your decision on the Blackwood offer within 30 days. After that, the county will likely move to seize the property for the back taxes. The clock is ticking, Leo." I didn't answer. I slowly untied the twine. The paper crackled as I unrolled it. It wasn't a scroll, it was a map. A hand-drawn map, sketched in faded black ink on what looked like architectural vellum. The lines were precise, technical, showing the topography of a section of mountain. My grandfather had been a surveyor before. A prominent X was marked deep in a cluster of contour lines, far from any road. Next to the X, in my grandfather's spiky, deliberate handwriting, were 3 words: "Sealed. For Leo." My heart hammered against my ribs. A sealed cave. What did it mean? I looked at the key, the cash, the map. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a puzzle. And for the first time in a decade, it felt like someone was speaking directly to me. Not to a case number, not to a ward of the state, but to Leo. My grandfather had left me a choice that wasn't on any official form. Sell and walk away with a clean slate, or follow this map into the past and see what he'd buried. The smell of sawdust and pine needles filled my memory, a ghost in the sterile room. The clock was ticking. I spent a long moment just staring at the map, my mind a blank hum of static. Mr. Davies shifted in his chair, the leather groaning softly, a sound that seemed to pull me back to the present. He was watching me with a professional curiosity, the kind a doctor might have observing a strange new symptom. He had done his part. The will was read, the meager assets presented. My confusion was now my own problem, outside the scope of his duties. "As I said," he repeated, his tone a little more brisk now. "The offer from Blackwood is generous, all things considered. They want the land for a new resort development. Access road, ski lifts, the whole thing. Your grandfather's parcel is a key piece of their puzzle. It's why they're willing to absorb the debt." I rolled the map back up, my fingers clumsy. The paper felt fragile, like a dried leaf. Tying the twine back around it, I felt a strange, fierce possessiveness. It was the first thing in 10 years that was mine and mine alone. "Why did he refuse to sell before?" I asked, the question forming before I'd even thought it through. Mr. Davies leaned back, steepling his fingers. Elias was a particular man, especially after your parents passed. He was always polite, but firm. He said the land wasn't for sale, that it was your birthright. He never elaborated. Birthright, another word that felt like it belonged to someone else. The only thing I'd ever been given was a bed in a room with 3 other boys who had learned, like me, to sleep with one eye open. The idea of a birthright connected to a piece of land, to a mountain, felt like a fantasy. He never mentioned a cave to you, or anything like this? I held up the rolled map. The lawyer shook his head, a definitive, final gesture. Leo, your grandfather became very solitary. After he placed you in state care, he cut off most contact. He'd call me once a year to confirm the will was still in order, but he never discussed his personal affairs. To be blunt, most people in town, myself included, assumed he was suffering from a certain mental decline. Grief can do that to a person. He let the property go. He stopped coming into town. He just faded away. A decline. That was the story I'd been told, too. That my grandfather, broken by the loss of my parents and the burden of raising me, had a breakdown. That giving me up was a last, desperate act of a mind that was no longer sound. I'd hated him for it for years, a deep, cold anger that had frozen into a kind of numb acceptance. But the map in my hand didn't feel like the work of a broken mind. The lines were too steady, the lettering too precise. This was an act of intention. I tucked the map into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pocketed the key. Then I carefully stacked the $2,000 and slid it into my other pocket. The weight of it was both terrifying and reassuring. It was escape money, or maybe it was fuel. I need to think, I said, standing up. The sudden movement made the big chair seem even more cavernous. Mr. Davies stood as well, a gesture of professional courtesy. Of course, but don't think for too long. 30 days can go by very quickly. Blackwood Holdings isn't known for its patience. Their representative, a Mr. Thorne, will be in touch. The name sounded like something out of a bad movie, a cartoon villain, an antagonistic force, as the social workers would say, except this one was real. Here is my card, Mr. Davies said, handing me a crisp rectangle of cardboard. And this is the contact information for the group home's transition coordinator. They have a bed for you for the next week. After that, you're on your own. On my own. The words should have been terrifying. They were. But they also held a sliver of something else, a terrifying, exhilarating possibility. I took the card without looking at it and walked toward the door. Leo, he called after me. I stopped, my hand on the cool brass handle. Be careful. Briar Creek is a small town, but those mountains are big. People get lost up there. I nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and stepped out into the hallway. The air outside the office was different. Just the normal, stale air of a municipal building. But it felt like I could breathe again. I walked past the receptionist's desk without making eye contact and pushed through the heavy glass doors out onto the street. The city air hit me, a wave of exhaust fumes and damp pavement. I had lived in this city, or one like it, for a decade, but I had never felt like I belonged to it. It was just a grid of streets that connected one institution to another. I found a concrete bench by a bus stop and sat down, my back to the traffic. I pulled out the map again, unrolling it on my knees. Sealed. For Leo. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation, an explanation waiting at the end of a trail. The $2,000 in my pocket was a ticket. I could take it and vanish. Get a bus ticket to anywhere. find a cheap room, get a dishwashing job, and become anonymous. It was the clean slate Mr. Davies had talked about, the sensible option, the safe option. But as I looked at the map, at the careful, deliberate lines my grandfather had drawn, I knew I couldn't do it. For 10 years, my life had been a story told to me by other people. A story of tragedy, of abandonment, of a broken old man and a boy who was better off elsewhere. It was a neat, tidy story that fit perfectly into their files. This map, this cave, it promised a different story. His story. And maybe my own. My decision wasn't even a conscious thought. It was a physical pull, a magnetic north I hadn't known I possessed. I was going to Briar Creek. I was going to find that cave. I folded the map carefully, tucked it away, and stood up. I looked at the bus schedule posted behind the bench. There was a bus heading north, toward the mountains, in 1 hour. I had just enough time to go back to the group home, pack the few things that were mine, and walk away from the only life I could remember. It was time for a different kind of transition plan. The group home smelled of disinfectant and simmering disappointment. It was a smell I knew better than any other, the institutional perfume of my childhood. I walked through the front door without buzzing, my brief status as a resident already a ghost. A new kid, maybe 12 or 13, with defiant eyes and a fresh bruise on his cheek, watched me pass from the common room couch. I saw myself in him, and I had to look away. My room was on the 2nd floor, a small space I shared with a boy named Mike, who was 2 years away from his own transition plan. His side was covered in posters of rappers and video game characters. My side was bare. A bed, neatly made. A small, scratched desk. A metal locker. That was it. My entire material existence for the last 3 years. I opened the locker. Inside was a change of clothes, a worn paperback copy of a fantasy novel, and a small, cracked photo in a plastic frame. It was the only picture I had. It showed a much younger me, maybe 7, sitting on my grandfather's shoulders. He was smiling, a real, full-faced grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I was laughing, my hands tangled in his thick gray hair. We were standing in front of the cabin. It looked different in the photo. The wood was a healthy, warm brown, not the splintered gray I imagined it was now. There were flowers in a window box. It looked like a home. I stared at that photo for a long time. This was the man they said had broken down, the man who had abandoned me. But the man in this picture didn't look broken. He looked strong, happy. He looked like he could carry the world on his shoulders, not just a small boy. I carefully wrapped the photo in a t-shirt and placed it in the bottom of a black duffel bag, the only piece of luggage I owned. I added the rest of my clothes, the book, a toothbrush. It barely filled a quarter of the bag. The sum total of a life lived in the margins. As I was zipping the bag, Mike came in. He was holding a game controller, his eyes still fixed on some invisible screen in his mind. He saw my bag on the bed. "You're out?" he asked. It wasn't a question filled with excitement or envy. It was just a statement of fact. In this place, people came and went. It was the only constant. "Yeah," I said. "Just turned 18. "Huh. Cool." He tossed his controller on his bed and flopped down beside it. "Where you gonna go?" I thought of the map, the key, the cabin. "North," I said. It was the only answer I had. "Got some family property up there." The lie felt strange on my tongue. I'd spent years telling people I had no one. To suddenly claim a family, a place, felt like putting on a costume. Mike just grunted. He probably didn't believe me. Kids here learned to lie about family. It was a survival mechanism. Sometimes you invented a rich aunt in California, sometimes an older brother in the army. It made the loneliness a little easier to bear. "Well, don't get dead," he said, his version of good luck. "Thanks," I said. "You too." I shouldered the duffel bag. It felt ridiculously light. I walked out of the room without looking back. At the front desk, Brenda, the peppermint-scented social worker, was waiting for me. She had a clipboard. She always had a clipboard. "Leo, you have your paperwork?" she asked, her voice bright and forced. "The lawyer gave it to you?" "I have it," I said, not specifying that I had a map and a key instead of a signed housing application. She ticked a box on her form. "Excellent. And you understand the terms of your transitional housing? 1 week. We can offer resources, job boards, rental listings." "I have a plan," I interrupted. It was the first time I'd ever cut her off. A small flicker of surprise crossed her face before the professional mask slipped back into place. "All right. Well, the system has fulfilled its obligation. You're an adult now, Leo. We wish you the best." She held out her hand. I looked at it, then back at her face. For 10 years, these people had been my jailers, my guardians, my entire world. They had fed me, clothed me, and told me who I was. And now it was over, with a checklist and a handshake. I didn't take her hand. I just nodded once, turned, and walked out the door for the last time. I didn't run. I walked. I walked the 12 blocks to the bus station, the duffel bag bumping against my back. The city felt different now. It wasn't my cage anymore. It was just a place I was leaving. The bus station was a cavern of echoes and diesel fumes. I found the ticket counter for the northbound line and stood behind a woman with 2 crying children. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the window. The man behind the glass looked bored. "Where to?" he mumbled. "Briar Creek," I said. He tapped at his keyboard. "One way or round trip?" I thought about the sealed cave, the back taxes, the 30-day deadline. "One way," I said. The words tasted like freedom and terror. The ticket cost $42. I paid with one of the crisp $50 bills from my grandfather's envelope. The change felt real, earned. I had 2 hours until the bus departed. I found a seat in the waiting area, placing my bag between my feet. The weight of the key in my pocket was a constant, solid reminder. The weight of the money was a nervous flutter. But the map, tucked safely in my jacket, was a steadying presence. It was a promise. The bus ride was a slow, rattling transition from one world to another. We pulled out of the city as the sun was setting, the gray canyons of downtown giving way to sprawling suburbs, then to strip malls, then finally to dark, open country. I watched the city lights shrink in the window, until they were just a faint orange glow on the horizon. And then they were gone completely. I leaned my head against the cool glass and watched the dark shapes of trees fly by. For the first time, there was no one to report to, no curfew, no one to tell me what to do or where to be. I was just a young man on a bus heading north. I was terrified, and I had never felt more alive. The bus was mostly empty. An old woman knitting, a young man in a soldier's uniform, asleep with his mouth open, a mother and a daughter who shared a bag of chips in silence. We were all just people in transit, suspended between where we'd been and where we were going. I tried to sleep, but my mind was racing. I thought about the cabin. Would it even be standing? Would the key work? What could be so important that my grandfather would seal it in a cave and leave me a map to find it? Was it the ravings of a lonely old man? Or was there a real purpose behind it? Hours passed. The bus climbed higher, the engine groaning on the inclines. The air grew colder. Outside, the trees were thicker, the darkness more absolute. I finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, the vibration of the bus a constant rumble beneath me. I dreamed of a sealed stone door and the sound of my grandfather's voice calling my name from the other side. I woke up when the bus driver called out, "Briar Creek, next and final stop." My neck was stiff, and a line of drool had cooled on my cheek. I wiped my face, feeling groggy and disoriented. Outside the window, the world was gray and wet. A thick fog clung to the mountainsides, obscuring the peaks and giving the landscape a ghostly, secretive feel. The bus pulled into a small gravel lot next to a single-story building with a sign that read, "Briar Creek General Store and Post Office." This was it, the entire bus station. The soldier had gotten off at the last stop, and the mother and daughter were still asleep. It was just me. I grabbed my duffel bag and walked to the front of the bus. The driver, a heavy-set man with a kind, tired face, pushed the lever to open the door. A wave of cold, damp air, thick with the smell of pine and wet earth, washed over me. It was the smell of my earliest memories. "You sure this is your stop, kid?" the driver asked, looking at my thin jacket. "Not much out here." "I'm sure," I said, my voice hoarse from sleep. "Thanks." I stepped down onto the wet gravel. The bus hissed and pulled away, its red taillights quickly swallowed by the fog. And then there was silence. A deep, profound silence, broken only by the drip of water from the store's awning and the distant caw of a raven. The town of Briar Creek, or what I could see of it, consisted of the general store, a small gas station across the street with a single, rusty pump, and a handful of houses scattered up a winding road. It was barely a town. It was a footnote on a map. I had no idea where my grandfather's property was. The map in my pocket was for the cave, not the cabin. I looked at the general store. It seemed like the only logical place to start. A small, hand-painted sign in the window said, "Open." I pushed the door, and a little bell chimed. The inside was warm and cluttered. It smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and something sweet, like cinnamon. Shelves were packed with everything from canned goods and fishing lures to flannel shirts and motor oil. An older woman with a cloud of white hair pinned up on her head stood behind a wooden counter, wiping it down with a rag. She looked up as I entered, her eyes sharp and curious. Small towns have a way of noticing strangers. "Morning," she said. Her voice was friendly but guarded. "Can I help you with something?" "I hope so," I said, setting my bag down. "I'm looking for a property. It belonged to Elias Vance." The woman's hand paused its wiping. Her expression shifted, the friendly guard turning into something more complex. Pity, maybe, or just old sadness. "Elias," she said softly. "Lord, I haven't heard that name in a while. You must be his grandson, Leo." My stomach tightened. Of course she knew who I was. In a town this small, my story was probably local legend. "Yes, that's me." "I'm Martha," she said, her voice softening. "I run this place. Knew your grandfather my whole life, and your folks too, before. She didn't need to finish the sentence. "I heard about Elias passing. I'm sorry. He was a good man, despite how things ended." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. "I inherited his property," I explained. "I need to find it." Martha sighed and leaned against the counter. "It's not much to look at anymore, son. It's about 2 miles up Old Hemlock Road. Just follow the main road here out of town. It's the first left. You can't miss it. It's the last place on the road before it turns to dirt and goes up the mountain. Hasn't been anyone up there in years." "Is the road walkable?" I asked. "Oh, sure. It's a nice walk, if you don't mind the quiet." She eyed my duffel bag. "You planning on staying up there?" "Just for a little while, to see it." "Well," she said, her tone practical again, "you'll need supplies. There's no power up there, no running water. Hasn't been for a decade. The lines went down in a storm, and Elias never had them fixed." I looked at the $2,000 in my pocket. It suddenly felt like a lot less money. I bought what Martha recommended, a powerful flashlight with extra batteries, a box of waterproof matches, a propane camp stove, and a small canister of fuel, a few cans of soup and beans, a loaf of bread, and a large jug of water. I also bought a cheap, insulated work jacket she had on a rack. It was 100 times better than the one I was wearing. The bill came to just over $200. My nest egg was already shrinking. As she bagged my things, Martha grew quiet again. "You know," she said, not looking at me, "a man from one of those big city development companies was in here last week, asking about Elias's land. Said they were buying it." "That would be Mr. Thorne from Blackwood Holdings. They weren't wasting any time." "They made an offer," I said carefully. "The lawyer told me I should take it." Martha stopped what she was doing and looked me straight in the eye. Her gaze was intense. "Elias loved that land. He loved those mountains. He fought like a cornered wolf to keep it, even when he had nothing left. There was a reason for that. Whatever you decide to do, you should know that." She finished bagging my groceries and slid them across the counter. The unspoken message was clear. My grandfather's story was more complicated than the one I'd been told. I thanked her, loaded the supplies into a second bag she gave me, and headed for the door. "Leo," she called out as I was leaving. I turned. "The key he had for that cabin. It probably hasn't been used in years. The lock might be rusted shut. You might need some oil for it." She held up a small can of lubricant. "On the house." I took it with a grateful nod. The small act of kindness felt monumental. I stepped back out into the fog. The air was still and cold. With a heavy bag in each hand and a duffel on my back, I started walking up the main road, my boots crunching on the wet asphalt. The town disappeared behind me almost instantly, swallowed by the mist. I was alone with the trees and the silence. Old Hemlock Road was just as Martha described, a narrow, paved lane that branched off to the left and immediately began to climb. The fog was so thick I could barely see 20 feet in front of me. The world was reduced to the road, the dripping trees that lined it, and the sound of my own breathing. It was a long 2 miles. The bags grew heavier with every step. My muscles, soft from years of institutional inactivity, began to ache. But I kept going, one foot in front of the other. I was fueled by a strange mix of dread and anticipation. Finally, through the swirling gray mist, I saw it. A rusted, leaning mailbox with the name Vance, barely visible beneath a coat of moss. A dirt driveway, more like 2 muddy ruts, curved away from the road and into a stand of dark pines. I had arrived. I dropped my bags and stood there for a moment, just breathing. I could feel the property before I could really see it. It was a presence, a heavy, sleeping thing. I walked up the driveway, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The trees opened up into a small clearing, and there it was, The cabin. It was worse than I had imagined. The roof sagged in the middle, looking like a strong wind could flatten it. The porch tilted at a drunken angle, one of its support posts having rotted away completely. The windows were dark and empty, one of them shattered, a black hole gaping in the wall. The wood of the cabin was a pale, leprous gray, covered in moss and water stains. It didn't look like the warm, happy home from the photograph. It looked like a tombstone, a monument to decay and loss. This was my birthright, a ruin. For a moment, all the hope that had propelled me forward drained away, leaving a cold, bitter residue. The lawyer was right. The sensible thing to do was to sign the papers, take the money, and never look back. But then I looked past the cabin, toward the looming, invisible shape of the mountain behind it. The cave was up there, the secret, my grandfather's final word. I couldn't walk away yet. I had to know. I took a deep breath, walked across the sodden lawn, and stepped onto the dangerously tilted porch. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy iron key. The porch groaned under my weight, a long, mournful sound like a dying animal. I moved carefully, testing each board before putting my full weight on it. The front door was made of thick, heavy planks, weathered to the texture of driftwood. The iron handle was coated in a fine layer of rust. And there was the keyhole, just as old and ornate as the key I held in my hand. I remembered Martha's warning. I took out the small can of lubricant she'd given me and squirted a generous amount into the keyhole. Then, holding my breath, I slid the key in. It resisted at first, a grinding metallic scrape. I wiggled it gently, pushing it further until it finally seated with a solid clunk. My heart was hammering. This was the first real test. If the key didn't work, if I couldn't even get inside, the whole journey would feel like a fool's errand. I gripped the head of the key and turned. For a second, nothing happened. It was completely frozen. I put my other hand on it, applying steady, firm pressure. My knuckles were white. I could feel the strain in my shoulder. I put all my weight into it, my jaw clenched. There was a sudden, shockingly loud crack, like a gunshot in the silent clearing. I stumbled back, thinking I'd broken the key, or the lock, or both. But the key was still intact. I tried turning it again, and this time it moved. It turned slowly, grudgingly, with a series of deep guttural clicks from inside the door. The lock was disengaged. I pulled the key out, my hand trembling slightly, and grabbed the iron handle. I pulled. The door didn't budge. It was swollen shut in its frame. I set my feet, leaned back, and pulled with my entire body. It scraped against the floor, protesting every inch. And then it swung open into darkness. The air that rushed out was cold and musty, thick with the smell of trapped time, of dust and decay, and the faint, ghostly scent of wood smoke. I stood on the threshold, peering into the gloom. The flashlight. I'd left it in the bag. I walked back across the treacherous porch, retrieved the flashlight from my supplies, and returned to the open door. I clicked it on. The beam cut a bright, clean cone through the darkness. The inside of the cabin was one large room. A thick layer of dust covered everything, softening the edges of the furniture and turning the air hazy in the flashlight's beam. There was a stone fireplace against the far wall, its hearth black with old soot. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A narrow bed with a thin, stained mattress was pushed against one wall. In the corner was a small kitchenette, a sink pump, and a wood-burning stove, both coated in cobwebs. It was a hermit's existence, stripped down to the barest essentials. It was nothing like the home I remembered. The warmth was gone. The life was gone. But as I swept the beam of light across the room, I saw something that made my breath catch. On the wall above the bed, hanging from a single nail, was a child's drawing. It was framed in simple, hand-carved wood. The crayon colors were faded, but I could still make out the picture. A big, smiling sun, a lopsided house, and two stick figures, one large, one small, holding hands. My drawing. I had made it for him when I was 6. He had kept it. He had kept it all these years, hanging it over the bed where he slept alone. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet washed over me. It wasn't just grief. It was confusion and anger and a deep, aching love. The story they told me, the story of the old man who forgot, who gave up, it didn't fit with this. A man who gives up doesn't keep a child's drawing on his wall for a decade. I walked further into the room, my boots stirring up clouds of dust. I ran my hand over the rough wooden table. I could almost see him sitting here, a lonely old man in a decaying cabin, the world shut out. Why? Why had he chosen this? My flashlight beam found a door on the back wall. It was smaller than the front door and simpler. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I pulled it open and was hit with a smell I recognized instantly. A smell that cut through the dust and decay like a lightning strike. Sawdust, pine, and oil. The beam revealed a small, attached workshop. It was crowded but orderly. A heavy workbench stood against the far wall, covered in tools. Saws and hammers hung in neat rows on the wall. Jars of screws and nails were lined up on a shelf, and in the center of the room, covered by a dusty canvas tarp, was a large, rectangular shape. This was his sanctuary. This was the room I remembered best, the place where he would let me hold a piece of sandpaper and help him smooth a piece of wood. The place where he taught me the names of the tools, the difference between an oak and a pine. I walked over to the tarp and pulled it back. Underneath was a surveyor's transit on a tripod and a large drafting table. The surface of the table was covered with maps, dozens of them. Topographical maps, geological surveys, hand-drawn sketches. This wasn't just a hobby. This was an obsession. I leaned closer, shining the light on the papers. They all depicted the same area, the mountains around Briar Creek. But they were covered in notes, calculations, strange symbols. It looked like he had been searching for something, or mapping something he had already found. On a small stool next to the table was a leather-bound book, a journal. It was thick and worn, the cover soft with age. A leather strap held it closed. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The map in my pocket had led me here. The cabin had led me to this room. And this room was leading me to this journal. This had to be it. The beginning of the explanation. I untied the strap. I opened the book to the first page. The handwriting was his, the same spiky, deliberate script from the map. The first entry was dated almost 10 years ago, just a few weeks after he had signed the papers and placed me in the care of the state. It read, "They think I'm broken. They think I've given up. Let them. It's safer for him that way. Now the real work begins." The words on the page seemed to vibrate in the flashlight's beam. It's safer for him that way. A cold dread, mingled with a strange, fierce hope, coiled in my stomach. This wasn't the story of a man giving up. This was the story of a man going to war. I sat down on the dusty stool, the journal heavy in my lap, and I began to read. I read for hours. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the small, dirty window of the workshop, and the world shrank to the circle of my flashlight and the spiky black ink on the yellowed pages. The journal was a record of a decade-long obsession. It was part scientific log, part personal confession, part strategic plan. In the beginning, the entries were filled with grief and rage. He wrote about my parents, about the accident. Their car had gone off a mountain road during a heavy rainstorm. A tragic, simple story. But my grandfather never believed it was that simple. The road washed out, he wrote. That road has never washed out, not in 50 years. I surveyed it myself. The culverts were clear a week before. Something is wrong. He wrote about his initial, clumsy attempts to investigate. He talked to the sheriff, to the county engineer. They all dismissed him. An old man, grieving and confused. They told him it was a natural occurrence, an act of God. But he didn't stop. He started his own investigation. He used his skills as a surveyor and his intimate knowledge of the mountains. He spent weeks, then months, hiking the backcountry, taking soil samples, studying geological maps, charting water flows. He was looking for an explanation, something other than bad luck. And then he found it. An entry from about a year after I was gone was stark and terrifying. I found the source. It's not natural. It's a leak, a chemical dump, upstream from the washout. They buried it, but it's leaching, poisoning the ground, making it unstable. It wasn't the rain that took out the road. It was the poison. He didn't name who they were, not at first. He just referred to them as the company, the developers, the ones who had been trying to buy up all the land in the valley for years. Blackwood Holdings. My mind flashed back to Mr. Davies' office. The clean slate offer. The pressure to sell. It was all connected. The journal entries became more frantic, more paranoid. He described being followed on his hikes. A truck with blacked-out windows waiting at the trailhead. Strange clicks on his phone line. He realized he was no longer just a grieving father investigating his son's death. He was a witness, and that made him a threat. That was when he made the decision. I can't protect Leo and fight this at the same time, he wrote, his handwriting shakier than on other pages. They know who he is. They know he's all I have. If they think I'm a threat, they'll see him as leverage. I have to make them stop seeing me as a threat. I have to make them think I'm beaten, broken, crazy. It was a performance. The neglect of the cabin, the refusal to pay taxes, the retreat from town. It was all a deliberate strategy. He was creating a new character for himself, the crazy old hermit of Briar Creek. A man not to be feared, but to be pitied. A man whose ravings about poison and conspiracy could be easily dismissed. And to make the performance convincing, he had to make the ultimate sacrifice. He had to give me up. I had to close the journal. I couldn't breathe. The air in the workshop was thick with the truth, and it was suffocating me. I stood up and paced the small space, my mind reeling. For 10 years I had hated him. I had built my entire identity around the foundational belief that I had been abandoned, that I was unwanted. And it was all a lie. It was a shield. He hadn't thrown me away. He had hidden me. He had sacrificed his reputation, his home, his final years, and his relationship with the only family he had left, all to keep me safe while he gathered the proof he needed. I leaned against the workbench, my head in my hands. I didn't cry. The emotion was too big for tears. It was a seismic shift, the entire landscape of my past rearranging itself. The abandonment I had carried like a stone in my gut for a decade wasn't abandonment. It was protection. It was a desperate, brutal, and heartbreaking act of love. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where one single piece of information changes everything you thought you knew about your own life. Where a story you've told yourself for years suddenly crumbles to dust. If this is hitting you, if you know what it feels like to have your world turned upside down, just drop a comment below. You're not alone in this. We build our lives on stories, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is find the courage to let the old ones go and embrace a new one, a truer one. After a long time, I picked up the journal again. I had to know the rest. I had to know what came next. The later entries were less emotional, more methodical. He detailed his secret work. He built a hidden laboratory in the woods. He gathered soil and water samples, documenting the spread of the contamination. He found internal company memos that had been discarded, proving that Blackwood Holdings knew about the dump site and the danger it posed. They had acquired the land from a bankrupt chemical company decades ago and simply buried the problem, hoping it would never be found. The road washout that killed my parents was the first sign that their secret was literally bubbling up from the ground. My grandfather had amassed a mountain of evidence, but he knew he couldn't just walk into the sheriff's office. Blackwood had money, influence. They owned people. He would be silenced, and the evidence would disappear. So he came up with a final plan, a fail-safe. He needed a place to hide the evidence, a place so secure and so secret that no one could ever find it unless they were meant to. A place that would outlast him. He began to excavate a small natural cave high up on his property, reinforcing it, sealing it, creating a time capsule, a tomb for a secret. The final entry was dated 1 month before he died. The work is done. The archive is sealed. The map is with Davies, to be given to Leo on his 18th birthday. It's all his now. The truth, the proof, and the choice. He can take the go money and run, live a life free from all this. A clean slate, for real this time. Or he can stay and fight. I hope I've made him strong enough. I hope he chooses to fight. But whatever he chooses, I hope he knows he was loved. Always. I closed the journal. My hands were steady now. The confusion was gone, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. The map in my pocket wasn't just a map to a cave. It was a map to my own future. My grandfather hadn't just left me a choice. He had left me a weapon. I looked around the workshop, at the tools hanging neatly on the wall. A heavy-duty crowbar, a sledgehammer, a pickaxe. He had left me everything I would need. I grabbed the flashlight and my new work jacket. It was time to go up the mountain. The fog had begun to lift, but a low gray ceiling of cloud still hung over the valley, and a persistent drizzle fell, soaking my jacket and chilling me to the bone. The air was cold, but I barely felt it. A fire had been lit inside me, a slow burning rage that warmed me from the inside out. I left my supplies in the cabin, taking only the flashlight, a bottle of water, the heavy tools, and the map. The map. I unrolled it on the dusty workbench one last time. It was a work of art, a testament to my grandfather's precision. He had marked the trail with landmarks I would recognize from my childhood. The split oak, bare rock, whispering falls. He was leading me by the hand, even now. The trail started behind the cabin, a faint path that was little more than a deer track. It immediately began to climb, switching back and forth up the steep face of the mountain. The ground was slick with wet leaves and mud, and the going was tough. The heavy tools, a sledgehammer and a long crowbar, I'd lashed together and slung over my shoulder. They dug into my collarbone with every step. Within 20 minutes, I was breathing hard, my legs burning. This was not the gentle, rolling landscape of the city parks I knew. This was wild, untamed. The mountain felt ancient and alive, watching me with a profound indifference. After an hour of climbing, I found the first landmark, the split oak. It was a massive, ancient tree that had been struck by lightning decades ago. One half of its trunk blasted away, the other half still stubbornly alive, putting out new leaves. I remembered playing hide-and-seek around its base, my small body easily hidden in the hollowed-out trunk. Seeing it again was like seeing an old friend. It was real. The map was real. This spurred me on. I pushed harder, the memory of my grandfather's words a constant fuel. He had walked this path 1,000 times, carrying his secret, his grief, and his hope. I could walk it once. The higher I climbed, the more the landscape changed. The dense forest of pine and oak gave way to rockier terrain, with twisted, hardy trees clinging to the slopes. The drizzle turned into a steady, cold rain. I was soaked through, but I didn't care. I found bare rock, a huge granite boulder shaped vaguely like a sleeping bear, and then, a half-hour later, I heard the sound of whispering falls, a small cascade of water tumbling over a series of mossy ledges. I was getting close. The map showed the cave was just a few hundred yards past the falls, in a sheer rock face that was hidden from the main trail. I had to bushwhack, pushing my way through dense, wet undergrowth. My face and hands were scratched by branches. The tools on my shoulder caught on vines, threatening to pull me off balance. And then I saw it. A wall of sheer gray rock, at least 50 feet high, slick with rain and green with moss. It looked impenetrable. According to the map, the entrance should be right here, at the base. But there was nothing, just solid rock. I ran my hand along the cold, wet stone. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through my anger. Had I come all this way for nothing? Was this the final, cruel joke of a broken old man after all? I pulled out the map again, my hands shaking with cold and frustration. I studied it under the gray light. The X was precise. It wasn't just against the rock face, it was behind a curtain of rock. And then I saw the other note, a small annotation I had missed. Follow the seam. I looked back at the rock wall, searching, and then I saw it. A faint, vertical line, no thicker than a pencil mark, running from the ground up about 7 feet. It looked like a natural fissure in the rock, but it was too straight, too perfect. My grandfather hadn't just sealed a cave, he had camouflaged it. He had cut a door out of the living rock and then fit it back into place like a puzzle piece, using his surveyor's precision to make the seam almost invisible. I ran my fingers along the line. There was no handle, no knob, no visible hinge, just the faint seam. This was where the tools came in. I unslung the sledgehammer and the crowbar, their weight a comfort in my hands. I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam near the bottom. I hammered it in with the sledgehammer, the clang of steel on steel echoing unnervingly in the silent woods. The tip bit into the rock. I put my shoulder into the crowbar and heaved. Nothing. The stone door was immense, and it had been sealed for years. I hammered the crowbar in deeper, then put all my weight on it, using a rock as a fulcrum. I felt a slight give, a scraping sound. A thin line of darkness appeared along the seam. It was working. Adrenaline surged through me. I worked my way up the seam, hammering and prying, hammering and prying. It was brutal, exhausting work. My arms ached, my back screamed in protest, and my hands were raw, even through my work gloves. But with every heave, the gap widened. I could hear the grinding of stone on stone, the snapping of the mortar or epoxy he had used to seal it. After what felt like an eternity, the gap was wide enough for me to get my fingers in. The door was incredibly heavy, but it was balanced on a hidden pivot. I planted my feet, got a firm grip, and pulled. It moved. Slowly, with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to come from the heart of the mountain itself, the stone door swung inward, revealing a rectangle of absolute, perfect blackness. A wave of cold, dry air washed over me, carrying a faint, sterile scent, like old paper and dried minerals. It was the smell of a place that had been cut off from the world. I stood there, panting, my body screaming with exhaustion, and stared into the dark. I had found it. I had opened it. I took a deep breath, clicked on my flashlight, and stepped across the threshold, out of the rain, and into my grandfather's secret. The inside of the cave was not what I expected. It wasn't a damp, dripping cavern. It was a room, a small, dry, perfectly organized archive. The floor was level, covered in flat stones. The walls were rough, natural rock, but they were dry to the touch. My grandfather must have spent years waterproofing this place. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing shelves. Not wooden shelves, but heavy-duty metal shelving units, bolted directly into the rock wall. And on the shelves were boxes, dozens of them. They were archival storage boxes, the kind libraries use, all neatly labeled in my grandfather's handwriting. It was breathtaking. The sheer scale of his secret work was laid bare before me. This wasn't the act of a madman. This was the work of a patient, meticulous, and deeply determined man. I walked deeper into the cave, the flashlight beam dancing across the labels. Soil samples, Sector 4. Water analysis, Briar Creek runoff. Blackwood internal memos, 1998 to 2002. County engineer correspondence. He had saved everything. He had built a fortress of evidence. On a small makeshift table in the center of the room, separate from the shelves, sat two metal footlockers. One was larger than the other. Next to them was a single sealed envelope with my name, Leo, written on it. My heart pounded. This was it. The letter from the journal. The final message. I picked up the envelope. The paper was thick and expensive. I tore it open with a trembling finger and pulled out a single folded sheet. I unfolded it and read, "My dearest Leo, if you are reading this, then you are stronger than I ever dared to hope. You found the cabin, you found the journal, and you found your way here. I am so proud of you, and I am so sorry. I know you must have hated me. I hope now you understand why I did what I did. I had to build a cage for myself so they wouldn't build one for you. I had to let you go so you could one day be truly free. What happened to your parents was not an accident. It was murder by negligence. The company, Blackwood Holdings, knew their toxic waste dump was unstable. They knew it was a threat. They did nothing because digging it up would have cost them millions and exposed them to liability. So they buried the truth, and in doing so, they buried your mother and father. Everything in this room is the proof. Every soil sample, every water test, every secret memo I scavenged from their trash. It's enough to ruin them, enough to get justice for your parents. But it is also enough to get you killed. My blood ran cold. These people are not just corporate suits, Leo. They are dangerous. They have silenced people before. If you bring this evidence to light, they will come for you. They will not hesitate. That is why I have left you a choice. It is the most important inheritance I can give you. I looked at the 2 footlockers on the table. The small footlocker is your freedom. Inside, you will find $100,000 in cash. It is every cent I had left in the world, money I saved and scraped together for you. It is clean, untraceable. I call it the go money. You can take it, walk away from this cave, and never look back. Go anywhere in the world. Get an education. Build a life. Forget Briar Creek. Forget Blackwood. Forget all of it. No one would blame you. I would not blame you. Your parents would not want their memory to be a chain that holds you down. $100,000. The number was so large it was abstract. It was a new life, handed to me in a box. It was the clean slate, the escape I had dreamed of in the darkest nights at the group home. It was safety. It was peace. The large footlocker, the letter continued, is your justice. It contains the originals of the most damning evidence. The internal memo admitting knowledge of the leak. The forged engineering report. The sworn affidavit from a former employee who I paid to talk before he disappeared. It is the smoking gun. If you take that box, you are choosing to fight. You will not be safe. You will be a target. You will be trading a life of peace for a life of war. But you will have the chance to make them pay for what they did. You will have the chance to give your parents' deaths meaning. The choice is yours, Leo. Freedom or justice. You cannot have both. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you more than my own life. Your grandfather, Elias. I lowered the letter, my hand shaking. The silence in the cave was absolute. The choice was laid out before me, stark and terrible. A box of money or a box of truth. A box of life or a box of death. I looked at the small footlocker. I could see the life it offered. An apartment in a city where no one knew my name. College. A future. A life without looking over my shoulder. A life where my past was finally, truly, in the past. It was everything I had ever wanted. Then I looked at the larger footlocker. It was heavy. It was dangerous. It promised a fight I might not win. It promised sleepless nights and constant fear. But it also promised something else. It promised that the names of my parents, John and Sarah Vance, would mean something more than a line in a 10-year-old accident report. It promised that my grandfather's sacrifice, his decade of lonely, obsessive work, his feigned madness, his broken heart, would not be in vain. I thought about the system that had raised me, the faceless, indifferent bureaucracy that filed you, processed you, and forgot you. Blackwood Holdings was just a bigger, more powerful version of that system. A machine that chewed up people and spat them out, all for the sake of profit. They had chewed up my parents. They had tried to chew up my grandfather. They had left me an orphan in the care of another indifferent machine. I could take the money and run. I could let the machine win. Or I could stand my ground. I could be the rock that broke the gears. I cried then. For the first time since I was a little boy, I cried. I cried for my mother and father, whose faces I could barely remember. I cried for my grandfather, who had loved me enough to let me hate him. And I cried for the boy who had spent 10 years believing he was worthless and alone. I cried until there were no tears left, and when I was done, the choice was clear. It wasn't even a choice anymore. It was a duty. It was the only path forward. I walked over to the table. I placed my hand on the cold, painted metal of the large footlocker. It was my birthright. Not the land, not the money. This fight. I ignored the smaller box. I left the money sitting in the dark. I grabbed the handle of the large footlocker. It was heavy, filled with the weight of paper, of truth, of lives lost, and a life to be reclaimed. I hoisted it onto my shoulder and walked out of the cave, back into the rain. The journey down the mountain was harder than the climb up. The footlocker was awkward and heavy, its metal edges digging into my shoulder. The rain hadn't let up, and the path was a treacherous stream of mud. I fell twice, my feet sliding out from under me, sending me sprawling into the wet leaves. Both times, my first instinct was to protect the box, curling my body around it as I fell. It was more than just evidence now. It was my grandfather's legacy. It was my purpose. By the time I stumbled back into the clearing, dusk was settling, turning the gray day into a deep, bruised purple. The cabin looked even more desolate in the fading light, a skeleton against the dark trees. I was exhausted, bone-deep tired. My whole body ached. I was soaked to the skin and shivering. But I also felt a strange sense of calm, the frantic energy, the rage, the grief. It had all burned away on the mountain, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. The choice was made. Now came the consequences. I half-carried, half-dragged the footlocker onto the tilting porch and through the swollen door. I set it down in the middle of the dusty floor with a heavy thud. It looked alien in the rustic cabin, a piece of military hardware dropped into a fairy tale. I knew I couldn't stay here. If Blackwood was monitoring the property, as my grandfather's journal suggested, then my presence here was a red flag. They would be watching. And now that I had the evidence, I was no longer just a curious heir. I was the one thing they couldn't afford, a loose end. I needed to get the box somewhere safe, and I needed help. I thought of the business card in my wallet. Arthur Davies, attorney at law. He was the only person I knew who might understand the stakes. My grandfather had trusted him to deliver the map. Maybe I could trust him with the truth. But I couldn't call him from here. I had no phone, and even if I did, my grandfather's paranoia had sunk deep into my bones. I had to get back to a city, somewhere anonymous. I had to get this box to him in person. I looked at the supplies I'd bought, the food, the water. My original plan had been to stay, to explore. Now it was just fuel for the journey back. I ate 2 cans of cold beans, shoveling them into my mouth straight from the can, my hands still shaking from cold and exertion. It was the best meal I'd ever had. I changed out of my wet clothes and into the last dry set I owned. I repacked my duffel bag, leaving the wet things in a heap on the floor. Then I sat at the simple wooden table, the heavy footlocker at my feet, and waited for full darkness. The silence of the cabin was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt full of ghosts, of memories. I could feel my grandfather's presence in the room, a quiet, approving weight. I wasn't a scared kid anymore, running from the past. I was a man with a mission, running toward a fight. Around what must have been 10 o'clock, I decided it was time. The rain had finally stopped, but the night was moonless and pitch black. Perfect. I couldn't risk walking down the main road with the footlocker. If a car came, I'd be exposed. I had to go cross-country. I looked at the maps in the workshop one last time, my flashlight beam tracing a path through the woods that would intersect with the main highway about 5 miles south of Briar Creek. It would be a hard walk, but it was the safest option. Before I left, I did one last thing. I took the child's drawing of the two stick figures from the wall above the bed. I carefully folded it and tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket, next to the map. Then I grabbed a handle of the footlocker with one hand, my duffel bag with the other, and stepped out into the night. I didn't look back at the cabin. It had served its purpose. It had given me back my past. Now I had to go secure my future. The walk through the woods was a nightmare. I stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the narrow beam of my flashlight. Branches clawed at me, roots tried to trip me. The footlocker seemed to get heavier with every step. More than once, I wanted to just drop it, to curl up on the damp ground and sleep. But every time, the image of my grandfather's face in the old photograph, the words in his last letter, pushed me forward. I hope I've made him strong enough. I had to be. After what felt like an eternity, I smelled diesel fumes and heard the distant rush of tires on wet pavement. The highway. I pushed through a final line of trees and emerged onto a gravel shoulder. I was miles from any town, a lone figure on the edge of a dark, empty road. My plan was simple and probably stupid. I was going to hitchhike. I stuck out my thumb. Car after car roared past, their headlights sweeping over me and then plunging me back into darkness. They saw a kid with a duffel bag and a metal box on the side of a mountain highway in the middle of the night. I couldn't blame them for not stopping. I was starting to lose hope, a cold despair creeping back in, when a pair of headlights slowed down. It was a big rig, an 18-wheeler. It pulled over about 50 yards ahead of me, its air brakes hissing. I grabbed my things and ran toward it. The passenger door swung open. The driver was a silhouette against the cab's dim lights. "Where you headed, son?" he called down, his voice a low rumble. "South," I panted. "Anywhere south." "Climb in," he said. "It's a cold night to be out here." I tossed the duffel bag and the footlocker up onto the step and hauled myself into the cab. The warmth hit me like a physical blow. The driver was a man in his 50s, with a kind, weathered face and a baseball cap. He glanced at the footlocker. "Army?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. It felt true enough. He nodded, seeming to accept it, and pulled the rig back onto the highway. "Name's Sal," he said. "Leo," I replied. We drove in silence for a while, the rhythmic thump of the tires a soothing lullaby. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, Sal was gently shaking my shoulder. "Hey kid, we're just outside the city. Where can I drop you?" We were on a massive interstate, the sky ahead glowing with a familiar orange of urban light pollution. We had been driving for hours. "Anywhere is fine," I said, my voice thick with sleep. "A bus station, a coffee shop, anywhere that's open." He dropped me at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. I thanked him, my gratitude so immense it left me speechless. He just winked. "Stay safe, soldier." I carried the footlocker into the diner. It was mostly empty, just a few tired-looking patrons and a waitress wiping down the counter. I slid into a booth, put the box on the seat beside me, and ordered a coffee. I used the payphone by the restrooms to call the number on Arthur Davis's card. It went to his office voicemail. I left a message. "Mr. Davis, this is Leo Vance. I'm not signing the papers. I found something you need to see. It's about my grandfather. It's about my parents. It's important. Please call me back." I left the number of the payphone. I went back to my booth, cradling the warm coffee cup in my cold hands. All I could do now was wait and hope that my grandfather's trust in this man had not been misplaced. An hour later, the payphone rang. The year that followed was the hardest and most important of my life. It was a blur of legal meetings, depositions, and late nights spent in the dusty back room of Mr. Davis's office, which had become our unofficial war room. The moment I had opened that footlocker on his conference table, everything changed. The look on his face as he read the first memo, a mixture of horror, shock, and a lawyer's grim recognition of a righteous fight, is something I will never forget. He had known my grandfather as a client, but in that moment, he met him as a hero. He took my case pro bono, his professional fatigue replaced by a fiery sense of purpose. Blackwood Holdings fought back, just as my grandfather predicted. They were a hydra. They filed motions to dismiss. They tried to claim the evidence was inadmissible. They painted my grandfather as a delusional, vindictive old man. They hired private investigators to dig into my past, trying to portray me as an unstable delinquent looking for a payday. They offered me money, a lot of money. The first offer was for $1 million. The second was for $5 million. All I had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement and hand over the evidence. The man who made the offer was the same Mr. Thorne the lawyer had mentioned. He was smooth and confident, his expensive suit a kind of armor. He told me I was throwing my life away for a ghost. He said I could have anything I wanted. But I looked at him, and all I could see were the faces of my parents in that faded photograph. I saw my grandfather, alone in his cabin, sacrificing everything. The money meant nothing. I refused. The fight went on. But something else was happening at the same time. The story got out. A local journalist, a young, hungry reporter, got a tip and started digging. With Mr. Davies' guidance, we leaked some of the less critical evidence, enough to get the public's attention. The story of the corporate giant, the poisoned land, and the family that was destroyed became a local, then a regional sensation. And people started to talk. Old-timers in Briar Creek who remembered the chemical plant that used to be there. Former Blackwood employees who had been fired for asking too many questions. A community of quiet dissenters began to emerge from the woodwork, and they rallied around my grandfather's memory and around me. Martha from the general store organized a town meeting. She stood up and told everyone how Elias Vance had tried to warn people, how he had been dismissed and ridiculed. She said it was time they listened. The cabin, which I had thought of as a ruin, became a symbol. With the help of some of the folks from town, I started to fix it up. A retired carpenter helped me sister the roof joists and level the porch. We replaced the broken window. We scrubbed the floors. We brought it back to life. I spent my weekends there, working on the house, my weekdays in the city, working on the case. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I belonged to that land, to that cabin, to that fight. The work was hard, but it was good work. Every nail I hammered was an act of defiance. Every board I replaced was an act of reclamation. I wasn't just fixing a house. I was rebuilding a home. I was piecing my own life back together. Eventually, the pressure became too much for Blackwood. Their stock price plummeted. Federal investigators got involved. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and a public relations nightmare, they folded. They settled. It wasn't a flashy courtroom victory. It was a quiet, negotiated surrender. They admitted no wrongdoing, of course. The official language was full of legalese and carefully worded denials. But the terms of the settlement told the real story. They established a massive cleanup fund for the entire valley. They compensated the families of other people who had gotten sick, people whose illnesses had always been a mystery. And they gave me the deed to my grandfather's property, free and clear, the back taxes and liens wiped away as if they had never existed. They also gave me a private settlement. The amount is confidential, but it was more than the go money in the cave. It was enough to ensure that I would never have to worry about money again. But the money was the least important part of the victory. The important part was the truth. The official cause of my parents' death was re-examined and amended. The story was set right. My grandfather's name was cleared. He wasn't the crazy old hermit anymore. He was the man who had saved the valley. I stand on the porch of the cabin now. It's autumn, a year after I first arrived. The porch is level and solid under my feet. The roof is straight and true. There are flowers in a new window box, bright red against the healthy brown of the wood. It looks like the house in the photograph again. The air smells of pine and sawdust. I've added a new room to the workshop. Inside, on a clean new workbench, I'm learning the art of woodworking. I'm not a master like he was, but I'm learning. The land is mine now. But more than that, it's my home. I never went back to the cave. The money is still there, I suppose, a silent monument to a path not taken. My inheritance wasn't the cash in that box. It wasn't even the evidence. The true inheritance my grandfather left me was the choice. He gave me the chance to decide who I was going to be. A victim or a fighter. A ghost running from the past, or a man building a future. He taught me that home isn't just a place you own. It's a place you fight for. It's a story you reclaim. It's the choice to stand your ground, even when you're terrified, and say, "This is mine. This matters." This entire journey started because one person refused to let a story be buried. He held on to the truth, even when it cost him everything. And by doing so, he gave me a second chance at a life I never thought I could have. So I want to ask you, what is the story you need to reclaim? What truth in your own life is waiting for you to fight for it? It might not be a sealed cave in the mountains, but we all have our own battles, our own histories to set right. Share your story in the comments below. Let this be a place where we honor the fights that make us who we are. And if this story meant something to you, if you believe in second chances and the power of truth, please subscribe. We're building a community here of people who understand that the hardest journeys often lead to the most beautiful destinations. Thank you for listening.